Hello everyone. Tonight I want to share something that happened not so long ago in a western district of Greater Seoul. In one of those low-rise villa neighborhoods, pressed between an older market street and a corridor of former factories waiting for their turn under the bulldozer. It's a story about fire that wouldn't warm, paper that wouldn't burn, and the small courtesies we owe to those who've left a room but haven't quite left the air. Let's begin. Choi Soo-jin knelt on a spread of newspaper in the empty second-floor flat, thumbing the wheel of a disposable lighter until the flame stood upright in the still air. She had laid out a short stack of ceremonial paper money on the floor near the window, the kind printed with old-fashioned characters and sold in bundles outside temples and funeral supply shops. And now she held the flame to one corner and waited. The paper browned where the flame touched it, curled slightly at the edge, but refused to catch. She tried again, holding the lighter steady against a fresh sheet, and watched the orange tip of the flame look strangely pale, almost apologetic, as if it were only pretending to burn. The room felt colder than the hallway outside, colder than it should have been on a mild afternoon with the heating long shut off and the windows sealed. Across the room, on a low sideboard, sat a small frame portrait, face outward, watching the proceedings with the composed neutrality of studio photography. Soo-jin glanced at it, then back at the paper, which still would not take, and heard a soft tick from the direction of the frame. Glass contracting, perhaps, or the wood settling in the uneven temperature. She set the lighter down, crossed the room, and gently turned the portrait face down against the surface of the sideboard to protect it from any stray ash or soot. When she returned to the stack and flicked the lighter once more, the paper caught instantly, the flame leaping warm and eager along the printed bills, and as the smoke rose, it did not rise straight, but leaned for a moment toward the space where the portrait had been facing, before curling upward toward the ceiling and dispersing in the draft from the crack beneath the door. In Korea, the burning of paper offerings is a gesture woven quietly into the rituals of departure and memory, a way of sending what the living can spare to those who no longer need addresses or bank accounts. The paper is burned with care, usually near a window or doorway, so the smoke has a clear path, and the offerings can find their way without confusion. Photographs of the deceased are often turned face down during the burning, not out of disrespect, but as a boundary, a signal that the meal is being prepared but not shared at the same table. The embers are fanned rather than blown upon, because breath belongs to the living and should not mingle too directly with what is being offered to the dead. These are not superstitions in the fearful sense, but rather small courtesies, gestures that recognize a threshold and ask that it be honored on both sides. In neighborhoods slated for redevelopment, where turnover is quick and property managers work under pressure to clear units and prepare them for the next contract, these rituals are sometimes abbreviated or skipped altogether in the rush to meet deadlines. Furniture is hauled to municipal waste zones, sorted into categories and tagged with yellow disposal stickers, and personal effects left behind are boxed and stored or discarded, according to a checklist that rarely includes space for burning paper or opening windows to let smoke find its way. The flat in question had been vacated 2 weeks earlier under circumstances Soo-jin had been told were routine. An elderly man named Kim Tae-won, a long illness, a family who lived elsewhere and had arranged everything remotely through the management company. The unit was to be cleaned, painted and listed as soon as the paperwork cleared. But Soo-jin, who had been raised by a grandmother who burned incense on the 1st and 15th of every month, felt uneasy entering a place where someone had lived and died without marking the passage in some small way, and so she brought the paper and the lighter and planned to spend 10 minutes alone in the flat, doing what she thought was right. She returned on the first night with Lee Junho, a junior maintenance tech from the building in his early 20s, who had agreed to help her set things up properly and witness that the ritual had been completed according to custom. They spread the paper money on the same spot near the window, and she struck the lighter. The flame appeared again, but seemed weak, its colour slightly off, and when she held it to the edge of a bill, the paper browned and crisped at the point of contact, but did not curl or ignite. Junho leaned closer and remarked that the flame looked fine to him, but when he reached out to adjust the stack, his fingers passed near the lighter, and he pulled back, frowning. "It's cold," he said, not as a joke but as a genuine observation, and Sujin felt it too when she moved her hand closer. The air directly above the flame seemed cooler than the air around it, as if the fire were drawing warmth inward rather than releasing it. The glass of the portrait across the room had fogged slightly, a thin condensation that caught the light from the hallway, and they both noticed that the draft in the room, faint but persistent, seemed to originate from the direction of the sideboard and move toward the window rather than the other way around. Sujin stood, crossed to the portrait, and turned it face down as she had done before, laying it gently against the wood. When she returned and struck the lighter again, the paper caught immediately, the flame warm and ordinary, and the smoke rose in a clean column before leaning just for a moment toward the place where the portrait had been facing, then lifting toward the window and dissipating into the cool evening air outside. 3 days later, Junho returned with Park Hye-jin, the property manager in her 40s who had been briefed on the incident and wanted to see for herself. They brought a fresh pack of ceremonial paper and a new lighter, and Hye-jin insisted on following the steps exactly as they had been described. She knelt, spread the paper, and struck the lighter. The flame behaved as it had before, present but somehow inert, the paper browning at the edges but refusing to catch, and when Junho leaned in to observe, he described the sensation near the flame as cold to the skin, a phrase that made Hye-jin set the lighter down and stare at the stack in silence. The ash from the previous attempt, which they had swept into a small pile near the corner, had settled in a faint ring around where the stack had been, rather than scattering evenly, as if something had pushed it outward and away. They opened the window, letting the afternoon light and air flood the room, and immediately the temperature seemed to equalize, the chill that had clung to the space lifting slightly. Hye-jin turned the portrait face down without being asked, and when they tried again, the paper burned cleanly and quickly, the flame warm against their hands, and the smoke rising straight and then angling toward the open window in a way that felt, to all three of them, less like physics and more like courtesy. Over the weekend, an elderly neighbor from the first floor, Han Myung-suk, a woman in her 70s who had lived in the building for over a decade, knocked on Hye-jin's door and mentioned that she had been smelling burnt rice at night, a sharp, acrid odor that seemed to come from the second floor and linger in the stairwell until morning. She asked if anyone had been cooking in the vacant unit, and when Hye-jin explained what they had been doing, Myung-suk nodded and offered advice without hesitation. He always opened the window when he burned incense, she said, referring to Kim Tae-won, who had lived in the flat. Every first of the month you could smell it in the hall. He knew the old rules. You have to cover the eyes when you burn. Open the way. Don't blow on it. Fan it. or let it go by itself. Hyejin and Junho returned to the flat the following evening, this time with the window open from the start and a cloth draped over the portrait. They burned the paper without incident, the flame warm and steady, the smoke rising and leaving through the window in a smooth, predictable path. Later, while cleaning the sideboard, Junho uncovered the portrait briefly to wipe the dust from the glass, and in the moment it was turned face up again, the air above the surface seemed to cool, just for a breath, before returning to normal when he set it back down and covered it again with the cloth. The final visit was arranged after Hyejin consulted her aunt, who in turn asked Jung Da-un, a junior shaman she knew informally, for advice. Da-un, a woman in her late 20s who worked part-time at a small shrine on the edge of the district, listened to the details and offered a few simple instructions. Move the offerings closer to the window, fan the smoke with a palm rather than blowing on it, and bow once to the portrait before turning it face down, as a way of asking permission rather than imposing a rule. Hyejin and Sujin followed these steps exactly, and the paper burned easily and warmly, the smoke lifting and leaving without hesitation. And when they finished, the room felt no different. In temperature from the hallway, the glass of the portrait clear and free of fog, the air still and neutral, they wrapped the frame in cloth, placed it face down in a cardboard box, and sealed the box with packing tape, and neither of them felt the need to return to the flat alone after that. Sujin, who had worked in property management for nearly a decade, later described the experience to a colleague in language that was careful and precise. "It wasn't spooky, just wrong," she said. "The lighter sounded normal, the flame looked almost normal, but it didn't feel hot. It felt like the air was taking something back. When I turned the frame over so I wouldn't soot the glass, the paper remembered what fire is. It burned the way it should have from the start." Junho, when asked by a friend, was more direct. "I kept thinking it was a draft," he said, "but the draft was colder than the room. It didn't make sense, and it stopped as soon as we opened the window and moved the picture." Han Myung-suk, when she spoke to Hyejin a few days later, was matter of fact. "He always opened the window when he burned incense," she repeated. "That was his way. Don't let the picture watch while you do it. That calls them to sit with you and eat, and if they're still here, they're not where they should be." Jung Da-un, in a brief phone conversation with Hyejin's aunt, summed it up in a single line. "These are manners. You're just finishing the goodbye properly. If you skip the steps, the room stays half open." There are two ways to interpret what happened in that second-floor flat, and both deserve attention. The first is rooted in the cultural architecture of mourning and memory, in the idea that gestures matter not because they compel supernatural forces, but because they acknowledge transitions that are otherwise invisible. Turning a photograph face down during an offering is a way of marking a boundary, of saying that the living are honoring the dead without inviting them to remain in the room as participants. Opening a window is not merely practical ventilation, but a symbolic clearing of the path, a recognition that smoke and memory need direction to leave cleanly. Fanning rather than blowing on embers is a way of keeping the breath of the living separate from the offerings meant for the dead, a small but meaningful distinction in rituals that treat the boundary between worlds as real and worthy of respect. In this reading, the paper would not burn because the ritual was incomplete, because the room had not been prepared correctly, and the offerings were being made in a space that was still holding onto its former occupant in a way that the protocol of burning could not resolve until the necessary courtesies were observed. The second interpretation is more material. Sealed rooms in vacant apartments can develop unusual microclimates, pockets of humidity or stagnant air that affect combustion in unpredictable ways. Certain types of ceremonial paper are coated with inks or finishes that resist ignition under specific conditions, particularly in low oxygen environments or when moisture has accumulated in the fibers. The sensation of a cold flame might be a cognitive mismatch between expectation and the behavior of a flame that is burning inefficiently. Its color shifted toward the blue end of the spectrum in a way that the eye associates with coolness even when the temperature is technically high. The fog on the glass of the portrait could be condensation from a thermal differential between the room and the hallway, and the draft that seemed to originate near the sideboard might have been the result of reflective glass creating a localized convection current or a minor air leak around the window frame that went unnoticed until the window was opened and the pressure equalized. In this reading, the behavior of the paper and the flame changed, not because of any supernatural acknowledgement, but because the environmental variables, humidity, airflow, oxygen availability, were altered in predictable ways by opening the window and adjusting the placement of materials in the room. What is difficult to dismiss, regardless of which lens one prefers, is that the behavior of the flame changed consistently and predictably in response to two specific actions: turning the portrait face down and opening the window. Both actions have clear practical effects, reducing reflective light and increasing airflow, but they are also the exact steps prescribed by the ritual tradition for conducting offerings in a space where someone has died. Whether the mechanism is courtesy or chemistry, the result was the same. The paper burned, the smoke left, and the room returned to a neutral state that no longer felt contested or confused. The flat was cleared within the week. The portrait was placed in a storage box, wrapped in cloth and positioned face down, and sent to a relative who had requested it. The property management agency, after an internal discussion, added a courtesy line to its standard checklist for units being prepared after a death. Turn photographs face down, open a window during any offerings or cleansing, and fan smoke rather than blowing on it. The addition was framed as a cultural sensitivity measure rather than a safety protocol. But Soo Jin, who had initiated the conversation, noticed that several of her colleagues, when they encountered similar situations in other buildings, followed the steps without question and reported no further irregularities. Han Myung-suk stopped smelling burnt rice in the stairwell, and when she passed the second-floor landing on her way to the laundry room, she remarked to a friend that the air felt lighter, less sticky, as if something that had been lingering had finally moved on. The unit was sold to a young couple in their early 30s who were unaware of its recent history, and during their first week in the flat, they placed a small dish of salt and a brass bell on the windowsill, items the wife had brought from her childhood home as good luck tokens. Neither of them reported any cold drafts, any trouble with lighters or matches, or any sense that the space held anything other than the ordinary weight of plaster and wood and the faint smells of a neighborhood preparing slowly for its own transformation into something new. If you ever find yourself helping with offerings in an empty room, whether out of obligation or simple decency, open a window, turn the faces of the dead away from the flame, and give the smoke a clear path to leave. Fan the embers if you must, but do not blow on them. These are small acts, and they cost nothing, but they mark the difference between moving on and moving through, and that difference, however you choose to explain it, is worth the few extra minutes it takes to get it right. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, everyone.